Well, welcome everybody to our Grief and Lecture Series. My name is Rick Bergh, and I'm live from First Memorial Funeral Home and Garden of Memories in Victoria, BC. Thank you for sponsoring this event to those folks, and it's great to be together wherever you are, wherever you're listening in from tonight. We're in Victoria at 7 o'clock p.m. Not sure what time it is in your country, but it's good to be together. You know, folks, I wanted to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while, and that's resiliency and grief, especially when it applies to what we're going through in this pandemic. It's an interesting conversation to reflect upon because I think when we begin to examine a little bit more carefully what's happened during the pandemic, we actually see some significant learnings, some things that perhaps might change our life moving forward. And so the topic is resiliency and grief. But the question I want to talk about tonight was why the pandemic has helped us to become more resilient people. Why? And perhaps even how the pandemic has helped us to become more resilient people. Here's a caveat here. If you've taken the time to look at the pandemic from that particular perspective. That's an important distinction there. Because so often we want to, bypass difficulties in our life without examining them and wondering perhaps if they've touched us in a certain way, if there's something we've learned during this process that might be significant for us moving forward, especially in terms of our grief and loss experiences. And that's really what I want to focus in tonight, because we know that grief and loss is part of our lives and will be part of our lives moving forward. So what have we learned that's important? You know, there's a concept I really enjoy reflecting upon in the grief world, in the thanatology world, and that's the whole concept of historical antecedents. A big word which basically means what's happened before impacts what's going to happen in the future. That is, what we've learned in the past, we bring forward to other events in our life. We apply what we've learned in the past to something that's happening in our present. And this is really important in terms of our understanding of grief, of death, and of loss. You know, it's really it's been interesting to me to talk with people over the years about death and dying and grief. And I've discovered in my grief practice, especially in some of my seminars and workshops, that there are many people who haven't been part of a death and dying grief experience of significance. You know, some people who haven't even attended a funeral or a memorial service or been with somebody when they're dying. And I'm not sure about you if you have or not. But when you haven't gone through something yourself personally, then you rely on that information coming from somebody else. Perhaps something you've seen on TV or heard from a previous lecture or a book that you've read, or maybe some information that's been passed on by another person to you. But those are their experience. And although they're important, your experiences are more important in terms of how you will deal with grief and loss personally and individually as a human being. So I'm wondering, you know, what has your death and grief experience been like in your life so far when you look back on it? Because I'm thinking that it's probably changed over the last 18 months. Because death and grief and loss has poured into our lives as a result of the pandemic. Loss in all kinds of different shapes and forms. And I'm thinking that you've experienced a little bit of this loss yourself. I mean, we can't help but be changed in our perceptions because we've seen during COVID death all over the place. I mean, we've seen it on television, we've seen it on social media, we've read it in the papers. I mean, almost every day. We hear about what's happened with COVID, people dying, people grieving, families trying to cope with loss in their lives from all different facets of loss that are happening. So prior to COVID, perhaps you haven't had much experience, but I'm wondering if now that you might have a little bit more. At least you've seen it. At least you've probably talked about it with somebody, because it's a topic of conversation that's right in front of us. Well, the truth is that we have experienced these losses. And it's really important to think about how we transition through loss to the future when difficult events happen in our lives. And they're happening and will happen in our lives on an ongoing basis till the day that we die. Again, I'm just very curious if your understanding of death and grief and dying has changed. What is it that you have learned? Because I think you've seen it, you've touched it, you recognize it, you've experienced losses on your own. And I'm wondering how you've managed, how you've adapted, how you've been able to move forward, at least at some extent. You know, resiliency is developed or happens in the doing. You have to go through something in order to develop resiliency. It can't just be taken from a book. I'm resilient because of this. You have to have experienced it in your life. That's how you develop resilient characteristics. And I just find this topic fascinating because I think we're at this period in our life when we can really dig into understanding it, because, as I said before, all of us have gone through a little bit of loss during this past 18 months. And we're coming out of it, hopefully even more so in the next while. And perhaps we have a few scars, but we're not devastated, at least most of us. I think all of us have adapted to a certain level, and we believe that there is hope for the future. Well, this developing resiliency is really important, and it happens over time and the many events in our lives. So depending upon the events in your lives that impacted you or are part of your narrative now, you have developed resilient characteristics. Not out of the good times, out of the bad times, the hard times, the valleys. Resiliency isn't developed out of the good times. It's not. It's developed out of the hard, mucky stuff that you've gone through and that you've come out of as a human being. And that's why this thing called historical antecedents is so important to reflect upon. COVID will be part of your history forever. And, we will talk about this to our children and to our grandchildren, and props to our great-grandchildren, that we are part of this experience. It's shaped us in certain ways. It's formed new understandings of life for us. And I think if we are willing to look at it, it's helped us in developing our sense of loss and how we might make it through the next one that happens in our lives. I think that's really, really powerful to think about. There was some interesting research that came out a few months after COVID began. A study that was done interviewing both seniors and young adults into how they were doing, how they were managing during this COVID crisis. And they began to look at who were more resilient. Which of these groups were more resilient? I'm thinking you can probably give me the answer to that. It was seniors. It was seniors who were able to cope. I'm not talking about seniors in isolation here, because that's another matter. But seniors in general, connected to community, were able to manage and to be able to adapt to COVID better than young adults. Well, why? Why is that? Because of historical antecedents. Because they have a history. They've been through other things in their life, and now they're able to adapt to what has come into their life again. And this is fascinating when you think about the brain, because we know that, experiences that we've gone through are added to as we go through the next loss. And we begin to look at the next loss through what we've experienced in the past. And our brain tells us, look, you've been through something similar to this. It might be a little bit different, but you've done this before, and this you've used, and you're going to be okay. And so our brain that's filled with this history, with these memories of what we've done in the past, begins to say to us, you don't have to be frightened. You don't have to be worried. You don't have to be anxious about what's coming your way, because you have some experience. You've kind of been there and done that. And even though it might be a little bit different now, you have something from the past, some tools from the past inside of you that have helped you to be able to move through. I want to give you an example of this from a 100-year-old lady. Her name is Dot. And she was going to celebrate her 100th birthday, and unfortunately, because of COVID, the family was not able to meet with her. But her daughter gathered together some of her thoughts and ideas on what was happening and what her life was all about. And she wrote this, and I think it's a wonderful example of historical antecedents and what we've done in the past that help us in the present to face the losses that come into our life. So listen carefully. The title of this little poem is called It's Always Something. Mom, there's a virus. It's all over the world. We can't go out. I can't come and see you. Well, she said, it's always something, isn't it? We'll get together when we can. But Mom, people are freaking out that the stores will run out of toilet paper. Well, Mom, we never had toilet paper growing up, she said. Used to use the Sears catalog, but you wanted the black and white papers. The colored ones were too scratchy. They'll survive. It's always something. But Mom, people are lining up outside the grocery stores. They're stockpiling food. It may leave other people short. Mom's replying, we grew all our own food. Shot what we ate, traded cord wood for flour and sugar at the general store. For years, we never saw real money. It's always something. But Mom, no one can go out to eat. Restaurants are closed. Mom replies, we never had restaurants. Always had food on the table, though cooked extra. Sometimes neighbors came by. There was always enough. They'll get by without restaurants. It's always something. But Mom, no one is traveling. Planes are grounded. Borders are closed. Mom, is that right? A long trip for us was by horse and buggy to Pataguac Wood. When we moved north in 31, our mom had never been away from her family. She was sad, but never let us know. We didn't go far, but we were happy. Not traveling could be worse. It's always something. But Mom, there's a pandemic. It's bad. Mom replies, my older sister was born in the year World War I ended. There was a pandemic called the Spanish flu. This will pass. It's always something. Mom, it's bad. Businesses are shut down. Others are having to make equipment and goods for the pandemic. Everyone is impacted. Mom replies, sounds like the war years. Everyone was part of the war effort. You hunkered down and got to work. Did all you could. It's always something. Mom, we're supposed to be all together this weekend to celebrate your 100th birthday. Edna, your sister, she's 102. She was flying here. All your nephews and nieces, family from all over were coming. oh well, we'll get together when we can. This will be over eventually. It's always something. It's always something. Isn't that fascinating? 100-year-old. Just hear the tone of her answers and the confidence she has in looking at her future and passing it on to her daughter and to us. Notice what she didn't live without, that I think is really important. You know, when you look at ourselves and what we've gone through in our pandemic compared to Dot's, we really haven't gone without, have we? I mean, the government has taken care of our physical needs to the most, making sure that we still can live in our homes, enough food to feed our families. But I find it so fascinating that even in the midst of what was given to us, that helped us to survive, we have more mental illness than ever. More drug overdoses and suicides happening. More divorces ever in the world. More physical abuse. One can go on and on. What's happening here? What's been taken away that's different from Dot's story that we might want to reflect on in terms of resiliency? The only thing I could come up with when I reflected upon this is community, is distance. How difficult it is and was and always is for us, even now, to be without people. To be without people. I have to say that for me, this has been probably one of the most difficult years of my life, of not being in an expanded community. It's hard not having people in our lives. And although I enjoyed some community through the internet with a choir group that my wife and I are involved with, it's difficult not being together. Dot's story was still being together with people. We need people to survive. We need people to survive. And I think it's been proven right now that the internet and social media and all kinds of Facebook groups don't do it for us. Because if they did, then we wouldn't have some of the challenges. Community doesn't happen as significant as it does in person. I'm not putting down social media and the internet, but it's not the same. That's been missing. And that's a resilient factor. Grief is not to be lived out in isolation. And I think that's a really important point. I think a lot of people believe that grief is just an individual experience, that we do it alone, our way, and that's enough. But it isn't. We need community in our grief experience. This has been verified during the pandemic so clearly for me. Forced to go into bubbles, see fewer family members, less time with our friends, restricted numbers. Again, we had to, I know. But I'm just saying that loss in the pandemic resulted in us spending less time with people who we need to support us, to listen to us, to encourage us, to cheer us on when life gets tough. And that's the loss experiences that we go through. That's when we need people the most, when we're going through the toughest things of our life. Dr. George Bonanno, one of the experts in the area of resiliency and grief, talks about these different traits of resilient people. And he says that most people, following the death of somebody, most people are able to adapt and move forward in their life. Some don't, but most people are. But he said some have these resilient traits that allow them to move more smoothly through that loss to discover what's on the other side. And a couple of these I thought were quite fascinating. First of all, just from a practical type of point of view, he says that people are more resilient when they have their financial resources in place, which makes sense. If you don't have your finances in place, that's another stress, isn't it? And so another thing that you put on top of grief, it makes it very difficult. People who are better educated actually are able to transition also, maybe because they have some information that others don't. People who have fewer ongoing life stressors. So if there's less stresses in your life during a time of a death and you're grieving, well, it makes sense. You'll be able to transition. Now here's the fourth one that's fascinating. This is the trait of a resilient person. Resilient people have a broader network of friends and relatives. A broader network of friends and relatives. And are optimistic, saying this will be okay, and are confident that life circumstances will change. It's not about individual grief. It's about community grief together. And think about that. We've learned during COVID how much we need people in our lives. I don't think anybody can argue against that. We realize how important people are and how much we really need them. Isolation has been tough on us. It's been very difficult for people, mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. It seems to me that shared life and community is a key factor in building resiliency, which means that if we're to spend time doing anything in our lives, we should think about developing strong, vibrant, authentic relationships with our family and friends and those people that we want to be in our lives. This outside of social media, outside of the internet, outside of Facebook groups, in person. I know we're still restricted, but I'm looking ahead here to what I think I need to do or continue to do in my life when I think about the losses that I will experience, which we all will. We need people in our lives. So if you're wondering how to build a resilient character, think not only to the individual traits that you need, but the communal traits that you need. People, authentic, real, coming alongside you through the losses of your life. Take a closer look at the people around you who are closest to you. Are those the people you want in your life? And if not, who do you want in your life? Who will you count on? Who can you count on when life is difficult for you? Choosing those individuals carefully on your journey, I think, is really important. Why? Because we know that loss will come again. Loss is part of living. It's part of living in this world. See, the world is not all a bed of roses. And no one promised you a rose garden. But there is a Dot, a 100-year-old woman who says, there's always something, and we will make it. You'll make it. And it seems to me we have. We have. And yes, there's a few more months to go. But now you, as a result of being in a pandemic, have discovered that you have become part of a lost story, perhaps many times over. And now as part of your history, your historical antecedents, it's in your brain, and you'll be able to use what you've discovered to adapt, to recover, to move through whatever mess, whatever loss, whatever challenge might come your way. We don't have to be afraid when grief or loss comes our way, because we made it through something, and you will again, as long as you bring someone along for the journey with you. This, my friends, is what we've learned through the pandemic, I believe, about becoming resilient people that can face the future in hope. Thank you for being with us tonight. Again, I'd like to thank First Memorial Funeral Services and Garden of Memories for sponsoring this event. I will have this up on my YouTube channel, rickbergh.com. You can check it out there. You can pass this on to your friends and families and neighbors and review some of the past lectures. And in November, I'll be sharing another lecture to do with the pandemic and grief. So again, thank you for being here tonight. Take care and good night.